Good afternoon, and thank you for standing by. I would like to inform all parties that your lines will be on listen only throughout today's conference. This call is being recorded. If you should have any objection, you may disconnect at this time. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Bob Grace, President of Sustainable Energy Advantage, who will serve as our moderator for today's webinar. Thank you, Mr. Grace. You may begin.
Thank you very much, Emily. Welcome to the New England Wind Energy Education Project, webinar number 4 in our series. Today's webinar will be on the topic of wind power's impact on grid reliability, backup supply, and fossil fuel use in New England. My name is Bob Grace. I'm President of Sustainable Energy Advantage and the principal investigator in the New England Wind Energy Education Project, which I will describe shortly. Our speakers today are going to be Ed DeMeo, who serves as a technical advisor to the Utility Wind Integration Group, Michael Milligan of the Transmission and Grid Integration Group at National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and Bill Henson, a senior engineer in renewable resource integration at the Independent System Operator of New England. Today's topic is an important one. It does not pertain directly to the issues associated with wind power siting and public acceptance per se, as our prior webinars have, but it's important in particular because a lot of the discussion around the issues associated with public acceptance get at the broader issues of wind's benefits and the costs associated with bringing wind in the system. And in that sense, there's been a lot of information made available where wind projects are looking to be sited on this topic. Some of that information raises important concerns that we'll address today, but some of that information also contains conclusions or assertions that may not be applicable overall, or maybe not as applicable in the New England region as they might in some other regions. So today we're going to have some excellent analysis and discussion of what is known on these issues to help set the framework. Before we go into our discussions, I wanted to take a few minutes to just go over the New England Wind Energy Education Project and specifically talk about what we're trying to accomplish with NEWEAP. NEWEAP was created to provide siting decision makers and those that are potentially impacted in the public with objective information on which they can make informed decisions about proposed wind energy projects throughout New England. We do this by collecting and disseminating accurate, objective, up-to-date information on critical wind energy issues impacting the market acceptance of all of the projects being developed within the region. Our objective here is to enhance the region's public acceptance of appropriately sited wind energy generation. The overview of the project, this is a 2-year project through the end of next year that consists of 8 webinars and a full-day conference, which will be next spring, as well as outreach and awareness. We will create and have created a web-based home for the webinar-related materials, which live on the New England Wind Forum website. NEWEAP was funded by the Department of Energy in December 2008 under a program for 20% wind by 2030, overcoming the challenges. All of the funding comes from the Department of Energy. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble forwarding the slides. Here we go. So just a little bit of overview on NEWEAP. The grantees, the proposal was a joint proposal by Sustainable Energy Advantage and the National Renewable Energy Lab. So NEWEAP is coordinated by my firm, Sustainable Energy Advantage, and directed by a steering committee, which consists of a number of New England state agencies, regional and national research organizations, and New England's regional grid operator, who have all committed to participate in the project. And the webinars are moderated usually by ourselves or other guests with particular expertise on the subject matter. The steering committee listed here consists, again, of National Renewable Energy Lab, Lawrence Berkeley Labs, a number of regional state agencies, and you can see all of them here. Again, NUIP is importantly neither industry funded nor industry driven. The philosophy and approach of the program is one of objectivity. Importantly, starting from the perspective that wind energy has benefits, but not every place is the right place for wind generation. Our framing principles are ultimately that the consequences of wind power are rarely as dire as made out to be by organized opponents, and they're often not as free of consequences as proponents would hope and sometimes represent. Our stake is in the NUIP process and not the outcome. There are often hard decisions to be made with respect to siting wind projects, and decision makers in the public need to be armed with good information as opposed to information from parties whose goals are either to build or to obstruct a specific wind project. So our objective is to have a good outcome, and that's why we want, and the steering committee is after, a fair representation of the issues. We'll certainly never be able to convince everybody that NUIP doesn't have a bias, but we'll try to do so and hope we can be judged on our on the information we put forth and the way that we gather speakers, the way we provide annotated bibliographies, including gathering data and positions that are counter to the speaker's conclusions, and posting all of that on the NUIP website, and the way we conduct Q&A sessions. I'll describe that further later, but we won't be screening any of the questions and expect to have some challenging questions posed. So we're doing our best job to make this a search for the answer and not one that starts with the answer. Our approach has generally been to seek out knowledgeable speakers who can convey credibility, objectivity, and address the research that's known out there with various points of view. Our content is focusing on what is known and what isn't known about the issues associated with each webinar, and with a focus on scientific peer-reviewed research and studies, literature reviewed. Again, we provide annotated bibliography for references, and we are willing to add additional materials that are forwarded to us by other listeners. And we will discuss mitigation, identify research needs, and so forth. I will talk shortly about the Q&A that we will conduct at the end of today's call. And finally, we do have a repository for the webinar materials on the New England Wind Forum website. So today's webinar will focus on New England wind energy impact on grid reliability, backup supply, and fossil fuel use in New England. We will start with Ed DeMeo. I will give a little further introduction of Ed in a moment. Ed will give us a little bit of an overview on wind power and the electric power system as an introduction. We'll then turn to Michael Milligan, who will discuss wind energy integration, go over a number of frequently asked questions and key results of the full range of wind integration studies that have occurred in the industry. And then we will wrap up with Bill Henson of ISO New England, the regional grid power operator. ISO New England is just about done with their New England wind integration study. So they've been studying these issues here specifically in New England to understand the repercussions of adding wind to the system, and will provide us with a very system-specific overview of ISO New England and the near final results of the New England wind integration study. Before turning the floor over to our speakers, I did want to run over the mechanics of our call, and particularly the Q&A sessions today. So today, we understand that there are many people who are very passionate about this subject matter, but want to encourage a respectful dialogue and frankly not allow individuals to monopolize our scarce time. We're going to be speaking for about an hour and a half and have at least half an hour for Q&A. In order to get all of the questions in, what we're going to do is ask participants to pose succinct questions in writing using the webinar's Q&A chat box. That should appear on the right hand of your screen. In typing out a question, we ask that you please identify yourself at the beginning of your written question with your name, your organization if you have one, or you can just say member of the public, and your state if you would. And then if you wish to remain anonymous, provide at least your first name so you'll know that I'm referring to your question, and your state. No need to offer your name. We'll ask that you pose one question each, please. We've got nearly 350 participants registered, and basically I will read each of the questions out loud in the order asked until we run out of questions or time, whichever comes first. I will not be screening or prioritizing the questions. I may skip a question that we feel has already been addressed, however. The questions that were posed will ultimately be listed on the website as well. And at the end, I do want to just point out that our next webinar will be in January, the date to be scheduled, and will address the impacts of wind turbine shadow flicker. And I'll come back to this slide at the end where we'll provide the links for additional materials. So now I will be turning the floor over to Ed DeMeo, who is President of Renewable Energy Consulting Services. Ed has been an independent consultant in renewable energy since early 1999, providing technical and management support to several federal and state programs aimed at advancing renewable power. Ed is focused primarily on wind for the past several years and serves as a strategic advisor to the Department of Energy, National Renewable Energy Lab, Wind Energy Program, the Utility Wind Integration Group, and the National Wind Coordinating Collaborative. From 1976 to 1999, he managed utility-oriented renewable energy programs at the Electric Power Research Institute, where he was responsible for major development and test programs in photovoltaics, solar thermal, and wind power. While at EPRI, he was a recipient of Discover Magazine's 1993 Annual Technical Award in the environmental category. Most recently, Ed has served as project coordinator for the DOE NREL OEA initiative to examine the feasibility of 20% U.S. electricity from wind power and served as co-chair of the advisory committee for that effort. Ed is an electrical engineer by training, a graduate of RPI, and holds master's and PhD degrees in electrical engineering science from Brown University, where he served as an associate professor on the engineering faculty. Ed, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Can I be heard here?
Yes.
Yes, working fine. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to give you just a little bit of background and introduction on this general topic of integration of wind into the electric power system. First, we're going to step back in time to the early part of this decade, 2001 to 2002. The situation at the time is that utility systems and utility operators in several parts of the country were actually beginning to notice wind power. They were seeing enough of it on their systems, several hundred megawatts, about the size of a pretty good power plant. And so they were beginning to realize that this was a technology that was different from the things they were used to in the past. Wind wasn't really under their control. It was under the control of Mother Nature. So the operators began to be concerned about the variability and the uncertainty of wind and what would be the impacts of that on the rest of the utility system, because the system has to be kept in balance between demand and generation at all times, and this balancing job becomes harder with a power generation technology like wind that's moving up and down with the wind. So there would be an impact on the cost of operating the rest of the power system, and the utility operators were getting concerned about that. And in fact, there was a fear that maybe that impact on operating costs would actually wipe out the value of the wind energy itself. So that was a serious concern. So this slide just shows a few of the wind plants of that era, late 90s, early 2000s. And the one on the lower right actually was and it still is in the service territory of Northern States Power, Minnesota and South Dakota, a utility which is now called Xcel Energy. And that utility took the lead and at asking this question, what would the integration costs be? So Xcel, Northern States Power, partnered in that era with the Utility Wind Integration Group, and along with a number of other interested folks, carried out a highly credible study of the wind integration costs using the models and techniques that were well respected within the power business. At the time, NSP, Northern States Power, had about 3% of their energy coming from wind, so they studied that. and found that the integration cost was not zero, but it was also not a huge number. It turned out to be about a little under $2 a megawatt hour, or 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour of wind energy, which was well under 10% of the wholesale value of that wind. So UWIG published a report about that, and also EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, who was a co-sponsor, also published that report under their cover. So that result was received with a fair degree of credibility. So what happened next? Well, for the next 7 or 8 years, a number of studies, probably over a dozen of this type, were carried out across the country. A number of different utilities involved in them, and folks looked at larger and larger regions. The studies got more and more sophisticated. When I'm done here, Michael Milligan will give you more of a rundown on the types of things that have been done. Larger regions were looked at because the utilities realized that they don't operate in isolation. They're interconnected with their neighbors. What happens in one utility affects another, and vice versa. What happened through all of these studies is that even up to very high penetrations of wind, up to about 30% of energy in some cases, that basic result held up. That is to say that the wind integration costs turned out to be under 10% of the wholesale value of the wind. Now, there are two primary reasons for that result. The first one is that as you go to larger and larger systems, and utilities then share their responsibilities for maintaining the reliability of the system, it turns out they have more generation to choose from, more loads to average out. And in that situation, it's easier for the system to deal with variability of any type, whether it be from wind or from load or whatever. So that helps, just going to larger regions. The second is that, again, as you go to larger regions, you're aggregating wind over larger and larger areas. And a wind plant that's 100 miles away or 200 miles away isn't doing the same thing as the one near you, and the variations tend to average out to some degree as well. So that was a very important realization that's come out of these studies. Just to give an example of that, I'm showing you results here from the Northern States Power and then the whole state of Minnesota situation. Results from 3 studies here. On the top line, you see the results from the very first study that I mentioned a few minutes ago, with the integration costs of a little under $2 a megawatt hour, with penetration a little under 3%. A year later, the Excel people looked at a higher penetration. They looked at 10% penetration, and found a higher integration cost, a little under $5 a megawatt hour, and that was not a surprise. That was to be expected. Then 2 years later, a study was conducted for the whole state of Minnesota. So instead of just Northern States Power, there were now 4 major utilities, 4 so-called balancing areas considered. And the penetrations of 15 and 25% were looked at, and the remarkable result was that even at 25%, the total integration cost turned out to be less, that $4.41 number, less than the 10% number for Excel by itself, which was $4.60. And so what you're seeing again is these 2 points that I mentioned on the previous slide, and that is that as you go to larger and larger balancing areas, it becomes easier to integrate the wind and deal with its variability. So what's happening with Xcel Energy today? They've got 2 major operating areas, a lot of wind in them. One's in Minnesota, one's in Colorado. And in both of those regions, they are now approaching and actually exceeding 10% of retail energy coming from wind. So what's happening is that they're now revising their generation expansion plans, largely in recognition of environmental concerns. the need to go to lower carbon generation, et cetera. And although they previously had planned to add coal plants, they're now changing those plans with the approval of their Public Utility Commission and replacing those plans with a combination of wind and gas. Now, wind, as I've said, is not an ideal resource in that it is not totally controlled by the utilities, but on the other hand, these folks who operate the systems are learning through experience how to deal with the natural characteristics of wind. Now, on the other hand, there are a group of folks around the country, a group of skeptics that are tending to fight this trend toward wind growth. And they've made a number of assertions. They will say that wind doesn't work, it just doesn't really displace fossil fuels, and it doesn't really reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and you know, it just costs too much anyway. But the fact is, what's going on in the field with the Excel folks that I mentioned and many other utilities that Michael will tell you about around the country, they're relying now more and more on wind for a significant portion of their energy. And you know, these are not fly-by-night organizations. These are companies that are required to keep our lights on. They have tremendous responsibilities, and they're seeing that they can rely on wind for a part of what they need. So experience has shown through these utilities that wind can and actually does provide substantial contributions to the energy needs of their systems, and at the same time reducing the emissions from their total suite of generating plants. So the position of the skeptics is grounded really in myth rather than in the reality of what is actually going on in the power sector today. So you'll hear a lot more about this in more detail from Michael and Bill, but Bob, at this point, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you very much. Before we turn over to Michael, I think I wanted to clarify one thing. Many of our listeners may be not in the power industry, people in communities where wind projects are proposed, not used to hearing units expressed in dollars per megawatt hour. Most people are used to looking at their electric bills and thinking of electricity costs in cents per kilowatt hour. So I just wanted to connect the dots here when Ed or Michael talk about numbers like $2 to $4 per megawatt hour. That corresponds to 0.2 to 0.4 cents per kilowatt hour, or less, the order of magnitude of a quarter of a cent per kilowatt hour when electricity rates in the New England area are going to be in the teens of cents per kilowatt hour, just for to give you an ability to connect the dots here. So as Ed pointed out, there are a number of valid concerns and questions that the people who operate the systems, the electricity systems throughout the country, have been asking. What will wind do to the system? How does wind impact the reliability? What are the impacts and the costs? And what additional needs do the system need in backup capacity, operating reserves? And ultimately, does wind power cause the offsetting of fossil fuels and emissions, as wind proponents have claimed, and what can be done to integrate larger amounts of wind? So Michael Milligan is part of the Transmission and Grid Integration Team at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Michael has authored more than 120 papers and book chapters and served on numerous technical review committees for integration studies. Michael is the co-lead for the Probabilistic Methods team of the NERC, North American Reliability Council, Variable Generation Task Force, member of the Western Energy Council's Variable Generation Subcommittee, the International Energy Agency's Task 25 on large-scale wind integration, and served on the Western Governors Association Clean and Diverse Energy Wind Task Force. Basically, Michael has been a major technical asset to many, if not most, of the studies, and has reviewed and evaluated the studies that he's not involved in. Michael has a master's and PhD degrees from the University of Colorado and a Bachelor of Arts from Albion College. and Michael will take us through, on an industry-wide perspective, what we've learned about wind energy integration. Michael, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Bob, and thank you for the opportunity to talk on this webinar. What I'd like to do is cover a few topics here, give you kind of a rough outline. We'll spend just a few minutes on power system basics in terms of kind of the relevant characteristics of the power system when we talk about wind integration. Wind integration is essentially the study, the analysis, figuring out how to incorporate wind as a power supply into the rest of the power supply. And as Ed mentioned a little while ago, what does that mean for the rest of the power system when you have significant quantities of wind energy? So we'll talk about that, just a real brief look at wind in the United States today. And I'd like to spend a few minutes on the integration studies in terms of, what are they and what is it they're trying to do and where does the data come from and so forth. We'll take a real brief overview of some results of some of the large studies, and then I'd actually like to spend most of the time on frequently asked questions about wind energy. And I'll point out as we get there, I'll do it again now, that the questions are fairly common questions. We've seen that across the country, around the world. The answers come from a combination of actual operating experience and from these detailed integration studies. That's kind of an overview of where we're going. I want to thank the organizers, NREL and the WEEP, for setting this up. I just want to take a minute to talk about some very large-scale wind integration studies. NREL has managed these studies on behalf of the Department of Energy. The first one is the Eastern Wind Integration and Transmission Study. It came out in January of this year. There's a website here if you want a little bit of reading material. There's more than you probably want here, nrel.gov/EWITS. It's a very, very large study looking at up to 30% wind energy penetration in the eastern part of the country. This sort of the companion or the sister study, the Western Wind and Solar Integration Study, was released in March. You can find lots of information about that, also nrel.gov/WWSIS. Both of those websites have executive summaries, which are actually fairly lengthy, 30, 40, 50 pages, as well as many hundreds of pages of reports, detailed analysis. And what these studies show is that you can get up to 30% wind energy in terms of annual electricity sales in the relevant electrical footprint. It does require some changes in operational practice, in particular in the West, but we have a pretty good understanding of the kinds of things that are needed to integrate those large quantities of wind. And in some cases, what's needed can be a little bit of a challenge, but we think it can be done. So let me just take a minute to talk about how we operate the power system. The graph that you see on the right-hand side of the slide shows, in the upper part of the graph, shows a sort of a typical daily load cycle. And what this is showing the demand for electricity throughout the day. This is a sort of a stylistic but a representative view of how the power system works. So in the early hours of the morning, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, as you see in the upper part of the graph, there isn't very much electrical load or demand for electricity. As people wake up, go to work, factories, office buildings, lights, computers, and so forth come on, you see a fairly substantial increase in the load, and that happens, throughout the morning, depending upon where you are in the country and the season of the year and so forth. In the middle of the day, there's typically a peak period, the maximum demand, and of course at that time the generation has to be able to supply that demand. And then in the evening, there's a little bit of a spike here. This is typical of winter time as heating loads go up, dinner time, that sort of thing. And then we have a decline in demand at the end of the day. And the process is repeated, of course, with variations day to day. Now, there are several interesting time scales within the 24-hour cycle, and those are highlighted by the little white bubbles that you see. The regulation time scale is very short, a couple of minutes, and the way that the regulation, or what the regulation is is a combination of people turning on and off the lights on a very short time scale, and there's specific generation that's tasked with meeting those small increases and decreases in demand. Over a little longer time period, from tens of minutes to maybe a few hours, there's a noticeable trend in the load. We call that the load following time scale. And that, for example, would correspond to the morning load pickup, where you have the morning pickup in the load, increase in the load, and the generation on the system has to be able to keep up with the demand. And so for that morning load pickup, typically the system operator will have some number of generators that are ready to go, they're synchronized to the system, and they're available to increase their output to match the load. There's also a longer time scale that's involved with most utility systems, and you see that down at the bottom. It's called unit commitment, and this shows a picture of about a week. And what this shows is that you have a lot of cycling each day. So each morning the load picks up, each evening it falls off, and the generation on the system has to be able to match the increases and decreases in load. So we know that there's a lot of variability in the load. The generation fleet that we've developed consists of combination of different types of generation units, from baseload units that run at fairly constant output most of the time, intermediate units, which are the units that are responsible for primarily picking up the load cycling, the increase in the morning, the decrease at night, and then the regulating units, the peaking units. We also have regulating units. The peaking units, which may only be called into service a relatively small number of days or hours of the year for those extremely hot days with very high air conditioning loads, or conversely, those very, very cold days in areas that might have extensive electric heating loads. And, of course, the regulating units are running more or less all the time. So we have a portfolio of different types of generation that manages the load, or helps us manage the load. We also have extra generation that is available to be called on if and when it's needed. And the primary reserve is called contingency reserve. And every area calculates that a little bit differently, but essentially the idea behind this is that at any moment a large generator or a large transmission line can fail. And so we're talking about a failure that's very, very big, and it's also very, very fast. It can happen in much less than 1 second. And if a generator should happen to trip offline as a result of a malfunction, there's other spinning generation that's available that can be called on at very short notice, so that there isn't any noticeable reduction in the supply of electricity. So basically the lights stay on. There's also generators that can change their output pretty quickly, and we use those to manage the variability in the load. As Ed mentioned, if you have a system that has a lot of wind, you're going to see the overall variability of the system increase. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, the other thing that happens today, and even without wind, is the system operator has imperfect knowledge of what the electrical demand is going to look like 1 day in advance when you're worrying about the schedules. How do I set up my generation schedules for the next day? And to some extent, there's some uncertainty even on the order of hours ahead. You don't know exactly when a storm system is going to move through. You probably have a pretty good weather forecast. Weather forecasting, as we all know, is not perfect. So there is some variability already in the system. Without wind, there's also some uncertainty, but wind is going to increase both of those. And that's really what drives a lot of the concerns over wind integration. This graph is actually based on data from one of the wind integration studies that Ed mentioned, the Minnesota study from a couple of years ago. And I think it's a really good illustration of what happens when you introduce a lot of wind into the power system. This is a simulation, essentially, that shows a 25% wind energy penetration. Now, that 25% is calculated as an average across the entire year. And in any given hour, you might have more than 25% wind, or you might have less than 25% wind. So what the graph shows in the red is the electrical load. So that's without any wind. And so the red shows you how would I have to operate the power system without any wind. And you can see the daily load cycles. There's sort of a double peak each day, and we know how to do that. Now, the green down at the bottom shows the wind, and I'll talk about how the wind power calculations for this integration study we carried out in a few minutes. But essentially, if you have a lot of wind on the system, you want to try to make maximum use of that wind unless there's a particular reliability problem. So I don't want to curtail or shut down the wind plants unless necessary because the wind doesn't require any fuel. And so I don't normally want to make the choice of saying, well, I want to go ahead and burn some gas or coal and curtail my wind plant. Normally it's the opposite. I can save fuel if I can figure out how to keep the wind plant running. And again, if there's a reliability concern, it is possible to curtail the wind, and some utilities do that as needed. But the basic idea is that for all the energy that is being supplied by the wind, I do not need to supply that part of the energy from my gas or my coal or my nuclear units. It's going to come out of something else. And so the blue trace that you see here represents what we call the net load. This is the electrical load after we subtract off the wind, and that's what the power system operator essentially has to manage. And you can see from the comparison of the red and the blue, there's more variability in the blue. You can see that in some days, the wind contributes quite a lot to the overall demand. In other days, if you look above hour 1240, this is 1240 hours of the year, that particular day, wind didn't contribute quite as much to the daily peak. And you see various other patterns in this graph. Today, we have wind many areas around the United States. I sort of outlined some areas that have more than 10% electricity coming from wind. You see Xcel Energy roughly in the middle, a little bit below middle at about 11%. This is from the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory's 2009 Wind Technologies Market Report. And that's a very good survey, and I recommend it if you're looking for some interesting reading about wind and its impact in the markets. This is an example of an actual utility. This is not modeled. This is not simulated. This is an actual week. This utility has an instantaneous penetration of wind of 35% of the peak. And if you look carefully at the graph, you'll see that the maximum wind output is occurring at a time when the load is low. And this is not uncommon. It's not what you hope for, but in this case, in the middle of the night, the electric demand is fairly low, but the wind is pretty high. And this graph shows that, this is a challenge. This utility is able to manage this. They have some flexible generation that allows them to manage that wind. And, of course, this slide doesn't really address the issue of certainty or uncertainty. You certainly would like to know when this high wind is coming so that you can position the rest of your generation to manage it. So let me talk just for a minute about integration studies, kind of what they are and what they look at. These are very detailed power system studies. They involve some combination of simulating the operation of the power system, and Bill will talk a little bit more about that for the New England study. What you want to do is represent the power system as accurately as you can, and so you get actual data for the performance of the power plants that you already have in terms of what type of fuel do they use, what are their operating characteristics, how long does it take to start them up. I mentioned the unit commitment process. For large thermal plants that might be operating, say, with coal as a fuel, it takes many hours and in some cases up to a day or two to get those units up to operating temperature so you can run them. And so this whole idea of unit commitment is important, and we need to make sure that we fold that into the wind integration study. So if a plant takes 1 day or 6 hours or whatever to start up, we want to make sure that the simulation knows about that. So we have lots of detailed data from the existing power system, including transmission loading limits, whatever we have available, whatever is appropriate for the study. What you'd really like to do is utilize actual wind data. But we're trying to study the impact of future wind plants that don't yet exist. And so, of course, there's no actual data. So in lieu of the actual data, we typically utilize data from large-scale numerical weather prediction models that are used to recreate the weather. And those models are essentially the foundation of weather forecasts in the U.S. and around the world. And it allows you to extract things like wind speed at any time and space that you want. And so, I've got another slide I'll show you a little bit later on, kind of how that's done. But essentially, we get some detailed wind data that represents the future wind build-out. And the data requirements are pretty stringent. And so, virtually every study that I've been involved with, there's a great deal of effort going into collecting the relevant data, making sure that the quality of the data is high. We want to make sure that we're accurately representing the variability from wind in as much accuracy as we possibly can. This is actually a slide that is based on our large-scale data set that was developed for the Western Wind and Solar Integration Study. You can actually see this on NREL's website. And what this is really supposed to show is that we model the weather around the region of interest, in this case the western part of the United States. And because this is based on a numerical weather prediction model, as I mentioned earlier, we can recreate the wind speed at any time and space. Now, what this map shows is different capacity factors of wind in different areas. And so the red blotches that you see here represent some very energetic wind resources. And the color scale, as you move sort of towards the cooler colors, these tend to be lower capacity factor wind plants. So their energy yield per unit of capacity is less as the capacity factor goes down. And for the Western study and also for the Eastern study, what we have is a large variation in the performance of the wind plants that we're simulating. So we've got a consistent weather model that's driving all the wind, and so the wind that we are feeding into the power production model is a pretty good simulation, and it does take into account the different wind speeds at different times and different locations across the footprint. The integration study results, Ed alluded to this, they show that we can integrate wind into power systems. We can do it reliably. We can do it economically. In some cases, there may need to be some operational changes. And in cases where there would need to be operational changes to incorporate large amounts of wind, those changes would actually be beneficial even if there were no wind at all. Ed mentioned larger balancing areas. We've seen consolidation of balancing areas and reserve sharing groups across the U.S. for decades. And that was driven not by wind. It was driven by the fact that there are many economies of scale and many reliability benefits that you get from larger operating footprints. Both of the integration studies have a rigorous technical review process. The technical review committees typically come from various aspects of the power system industry and folks with various subject matter knowledge. The Utility Wind Integration Group is essentially an industry group of folks that are trying to better understand the issues behind wind integration. This is primarily power system. I believe that all of the independent system operators and regional transmission organizations in the United States are members of UID, along with many utilities. And if you are interested in following other integration study results, I recommend UID.org as a website. Go to the Wind Integration Library, and there's plenty of information on these studies. One of the things that we found in both the Eastern and the Western studies at NREL is that you can operate with up to 30% wind. As I mentioned, there are some challenges. We won't have time to talk too much about those challenges, but I will hit some of them here a little bit later. Wind does reduce emissions, including carbon. The graph on the left is from the Western study, and what that shows is the reduction in emissions depending upon the relative fuel prices of gas and coal. It depends, let me rephrase that. If you have high natural gas prices, then you basically turn on the natural gas plants last because you don't want to burn much gas because it's expensive, and you turn them off as soon as you can. So that puts natural gas on the margin. When wind comes in, you want to turn off the most expensive plant you have, and when that's a natural gas plant, it's natural gas that gets turned off. Conversely, if, now this isn't really the case, but if coal were more expensive than natural gas, the coal plant would be the last one you'd want to turn on and the first one you'd want to turn off. There's, of course, a lot of middle ground in all that, but essentially what the study showed is that the emission savings that you get depends to some extent on the fuel prices, gas versus coal. The right-hand graph is from the Eastern study. It's unfortunately a little harder to compare this one. The Eastern study looked at carbon reductions from 2008. And so it appears as though there's not a big reduction, but then if you say, well, gee, you know, the study year was 2024, and without wind, carbon would be increasing between 2008 and 2024. And we estimate somewhere around a 33, maybe 45%, something like that, reduction in carbon from the 2024 base case, and the wind would reduce carbon accordingly. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is the reliability organization for the United States, has a number of working groups looking at wind integration. And it's not so much a question of if we can integrate, it's a question of how we do it. And that work is ongoing. There are a number of reports that are in process. A couple of reports have been approved by NERC that show some of the things that we need to think about as we move towards a higher wind future. The frequently asked questions I'd like to talk about came from an article. I did not choose this title, Wind Myths Debunked. This was in a recent Power and Energy magazine, which is a publication of the IEEE Power Engineering Society. We had a number of co-authors. Ed DeMeo, you recognize his name here. We had folks from literally around the world. And many of the folks from, say, Hanle Holtman, for example, from Finland, chairs the International Energy Task 25 on large-scale wind integration. We have various consultants. We have folks from GE Energy, University College Dublin, and Sweden. And what we did in this article was to take a look at these questions, and the questions that we addressed are questions that we've seen people ask. We've heard people ask from around the world, and so we focused on these questions and attempted to answer them in as simple a way as we could. And these are the questions, and I'll go through them one by one here. But the first question is, can you, if you're a grid operator, can you deal with the continually changing output of wind? Second question, does wind have a capacity credit? Third question, does the wind stop blowing everywhere at the same time? Number four, to what extent can you predict wind power? Number five, isn't it expensive to integrate wind? Number six, doesn't wind require new transmission, and doesn't that make wind expensive? Number seven, does wind need backup generation, and don't you burn more fossil fuel with wind than without? Number eight, the question we hear a lot, do you need storage to integrate wind? Number nine, is all the existing flexibility that we have in the fleet, isn't it already used up? Number 10, is wind really as good as coal or nuclear, because the capacity factor of wind is so much less than coal or nuclear? And then last question that I hear a lot, is there a limit to how much wind that we can accommodate on the power system? So I'll try to go through each of these questions and answer them in the time that we have. The answers do come from a number of studies around the world. You see a picture of the cover page for the International Energy Agency Phase 1 report, and this is really a comparison of wind integration experiences and studies from around the world. That work is ongoing. There's a second phase in process. I mentioned UIG. UIG is a tremendous source of wind integration studies, and I certainly recommend that if you're interested in reading more about it. And we've done a lot of work here at NREL as well. So the first question, can you deal with the continually changing output of wind generation? There are two graphs on this slide. The first graph on the left, is from West Denmark. And this is a particularly interesting case because what you see in the pink is the electrical load, and you should probably recognize that daily pattern. And in the blue, below that, you see the wind. And it's interesting that there are a couple of times when the wind actually does exceed the load. And you say, well, how is it possible? How could you possibly have a system where you've got more wind power coming into the system than you have electrical load. Well, it turns out West Denmark has a lot of good interconnections with the rest of Europe. And what this slide highlights for me is the power of large, no pun intended, the power of large energy markets to help integrate wind. Denmark was able to export a lot of this energy to the neighbors. The neighbors were able to buy low-cost energy, and so they were able to avoid burning more expensive fossil fuels. And so this really points to the advantage of large energy markets in wind integration. The slide on the right is from Ireland. This is from, I believe it was last May, where Ireland achieved a 40% instantaneous wind energy penetration. Now, Ireland is very, very different than Denmark. Ireland is an island system. It has a very small interconnection with Europe. I think it's about 100 megawatt capacity on about a 5,000 megawatt system. And so what this shows is that if you have a system that has flexible generation, you can manage a pretty significant level of wind energy. As an island grid, the Irish grid operator has planned and built a system that says, you know, we really can't rely very much on the neighbors because we don't really have any neighbors. And so we've got to make sure that we have flexible generation to deal with our own needs, and that's turned out to be really valuable in integrating wind. This next slide shows the power of aggregation. This is from data that we collect here at NREL from a number of different wind plants around the country. This is based on 1-second wind power data. The time scale is about 8 hours, and down at the bottom of this graph in the dark blue, what you see is a collection of 15 wind turbines. And if you look at that, you can see there's a lot of variability. Now, I will say that we've normalized the y-axis because we want to take a look at the variability per unit of installed capacity. So there's a lot of variability here in the 16 or the 15 wind turbines that we have. And then if you take the same wind plant, you go to another collection of turbines, 200 turbines. Well, these turbines, because there's so many of them, are spread out, and so you see that the per unit variability is less than it was for the 15 turbines. And then the next question is, well, okay, so now you have 15 turbines that are pretty variable. You add those to the 200 turbines. What happens? Well, the red up at the top shows what you get. And essentially the statistics that you see there show the sort of an index of variability. And without going into the gory detail, the variability per unit declines. And as Ed mentioned earlier, this aggregation is a tremendously powerful feature, not only for wind, but also of load. So over larger footprints, larger wind penetrations, the overall gross variability goes up, but per unit, you have less variability to deal with. The second question is whether wind has capacity value. Now, this is a topic that we probably don't really have time to explore in detail, but the bottom line is that we use the same basic techniques for analyzing wind's contribution to overall capacity needs of the system as we do for other power plant technologies, coal or gas or hydro, you name it. The bottom line is that we want to make sure that we hold the overall reliability of the system constant. And in this example graph, we're building a system with what we call a loss of load expectation of 1 day in 10 years. And so we can't build a perfectly reliable system because we can't afford it. But what we can do is build a very reliable system. And in this case, as you add, I don't remember what the number was here. This is an illustration. Say 1,000 megawatts of wind capacity to the system, you get about 400 megawatts of capacity value. We've seen wind capacity values ranging anywhere from about 5% of rated capacity of the wind plant up to about 40%. And it depends on the wind, it depends on the location of the wind, it depends on how much wind you're putting on the system, and it depends on how the wind is correlated with the rest of your load. So wind does have capacity value, but it's not nearly as much as you would get off of a thermal unit. For example, a natural gas plant might give you 90% of its capacity value. Wind, maybe it's 20%. I'm going to skip through this slide. This basically just shows that There are a number of entities around the United States that use non-reliability-based metrics. These are essentially approximation methods. And if you're interested, I can give you more citations on what this means. The next slide, how often does the wind stop blowing everywhere at the same time? This is actually an event that occurred in Texas a couple of years ago, February of 2007. And what happened was there was a very, very large dust storm that moved through Texas. And in the bottom picture, this is actually a satellite image that we got from WindLogix. And you see the little yellow highlight that shows the dust. And so what this is telling us is this is a pretty big storm. It was visible from the satellite. You could see the dust swirling around. And what happens is that wind turbines are built and designed so that they protect themselves when the wind is too high. And so the wind turbine will shut off, somewhere around 50 miles an hour, but it depends on the wind turbine. This particular storm moved through Texas, and as you can see in the right-hand upper graph, there was a decline in wind output. If you go over to the upper left-hand part of the graph, you'll see it's a little hard to make out in the graph here, but we have traces for many of the wind plants. And in some cases, they dropped off pretty quickly. And you can see the red trace where there's about 170 megawatt decline in wind over a 15-minute period. So, that's obviously cause for concern. But in aggregate, when you take a look at all the wind plants across Texas, there's about a 1,500 megawatt drop over a 2-hour period. Now, you would certainly want to know that's coming. But what these graphs show is that you have to be very careful about extrapolating what happens in a small wind plant to what happens over a large balancing footprint. So if you were to look at the right-hand or the left-hand graph and say, gee, 170 megawatts in 15 minutes, what if I had 100 times more wind? And well, that's a pretty frightening statistic, but it wouldn't happen in reality because the wind turbines are spread out. They don't see the same wind speed at the same time. And there was another event in Texas that had kind of a similar result. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. I've got a lot of slides to cover, and I know we want to hear from Bill Henson and have some Q&A time. But kind of the upshot for this slide is that, yes, we can predict wind power. It's harder to predict day ahead than it is hour ahead. But we'll never be able to produce it or forecast it perfectly. But the relative forecast errors decline for large footprints in the same way that the wind variability declines per unit over large footprints. Ed talked about some of the integration studies. This is another summary of a few additional integration studies. And I caution you, if you're comparing these really closely, many of these studies utilize different methods to calculate wind integration cost. They all have different penetration rates, or many of them have different penetration rates. But if you take a look at the range of integration costs, it's relatively low. If you say, well, why does it cost more to integrate wind? The primary cost really comes from additional operating reserve. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to go out and build new generation when you put in wind. What it means is that the generation that you have needs to be operated differently. It's going to be moving around, ramping. You're going to be turning it down. You've got some efficiency losses. And so there is a cost impact of all of that. When people talk about additional reserves for wind, we're not talking about a constant level of backup of some kind that's available 8,760 hours of the year. There's a recognition that sometimes you're not getting any wind energy. If you're not getting any wind energy from your wind turbines, then clearly you don't need to worry about backing up the wind. It's already at zero, and you're running the rest of your generation fleet to meet the load accordingly. The variability of wind does combine with the variability of load. There's very little correlation. That's good and bad. It's bad because you'd like to have perfect correlation, wind going up every time the load goes up. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. Wind does sometimes go up when the load goes up, and it sometimes goes down when the load goes up. And so the good news of that is that the variabilities combine, and So you don't need to back up wind one for one. We don't actually back up any generation in the system one for one because it's too expensive. We also find that small balancing areas will find it more difficult and more costly to integrate wind because, as Ed mentioned, they don't have the diversity in wind. They also don't have the diversity in load. We also find that sub-hourly energy markets help tremendously in managing the variability. Now, the sub-hourly energy market does not magically reduce the variability that you have on the system, but what it does is it allows you greater access to the flexibility that you do have on the power system. And so we see that as a very big factor in integrating wind. Don't you need new transmission for wind, and doesn't that make wind expensive? Well, you generally need transmission for most new generation sources. You may need more for wind if you're bringing in remote wind to a load center. And certainly, transmission does have a cost. Some work by the Midwest Independent System Operator and a number of other regional transmission organizations in the East found a benefit-cost ratio of 1.7 to 1 for transmission that would support a 20% wind energy penetration. And transmission tends to be a pretty low percentage of overall power costs. And I think that the real takeaway is this last bullet point. If you build transmission, that allows you access to other generation which may be less expensive than what you have locally. And one of the things that we found in the Eastern Wind Integration and Transmission Study is that building transmission means that you can either defer or avoid building generation. Generation is where the real big cost is, not only in terms of the capital cost, but also the fuel that you need to buy over the lifetime of the gas or the coal plant. And so, yeah, there's a cost to transmission. I don't want to totally gloss over it, but I think, like anything else, you need to do a detailed cost-benefit analysis to figure out, is this particular transmission, does it have value that exceeds its cost? If so, we should build it. If its cost exceeds its value, we should not build it. What about backup generation? Don't we burn more fuel with wind than without because of the backup? And the simple answer is no. We never back up individual generation. We don't do that with wind. We could, but it's very, very expensive to do so. When you have wind coming into the power system, what it means is that you can back down some other generation. And typically, the unit that you want to back down is the one that's most expensive. That's typically a unit that's burning fuel. Now, if you've got a large nuclear unit on your system, you typically cannot back that one down. So you go to the unit that's the most expensive that does have the physical capability of altering its output over the time frame in question. Now, there can be an efficiency loss. If you've got a gas plant or coal plant and you turn it down and you say, well, gee, per megawatt hour that it's generating, I'm finding I've got to burn more fuel. But I like to sort of think of this analogy, and like all analogies, it's not perfect, but suppose you have three people who commute to work. They all live right next to an interstate highway. They hop in their cars. They drive to work. They get very good mileage in their cars, I don't know, 30 miles a gallon, whatever number you want. And then they realize they're neighbors and they live and work nearby, so they decide to carpool. But as a result of carpooling, whoever's driving has to make a couple of stops to pick up the riders, and that may also involve stoplights and stop signs. And say, well, whoever's driving the car has now had a decline in their fuel efficiency. You're getting, 20, 25 miles to the gallon instead of 30. Are you burning more fuel? Yeah, that one driver may be, but the other two drivers are actually leaving their cars at home. And that's what we find with wind. It turns out that in the Western study, and I think this is on an earlier slide, in the Western study, what we found is that for every 3 megawatt hours of wind, you could avoid committing about 2 megawatts of conventional generations. And when we say avoid committing, we're saying you shut it off. So it isn't spinning, it isn't burning fuel, it's sleeping because you don't need it. And of course, you can do that if you have a reasonably good wind energy forecast. Another common question we get, Well, you know, if you're going to put in all this wind, don't you need some sort of storage? It could be pump storage, it could be a big battery. We don't find that. What we do find is that storage always has value. We've been building storage in the U.S. We haven't built so much in recent years, but back in the 60s and 70s, we had a lot of big coal units coming online. We had a lot of big nuclear units coming online, and it was decided at the time that, you know, you can't really move those nukes and those big coal plants around. Wouldn't it be nice to pump water up the hill during the night when you don't really need all that energy, and then the next day you let the water come down and turn a turbine, and certainly there's a lot of value to that. But when you take a look at the detailed operational analysis for existing wind plants as well as integration studies, we don't find a need for storage. We find that if you have storage, you're going to use it, and that's a great thing. We love storage, but it's going to be pretty difficult to justify storage on a cost-benefit basis at today's storage prices. We can also think about storage in terms of fuels. If I've got natural gas, if I don't burn the gas, I can store that gas in the ground. That's another form of storage, which we do take advantage of. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through these two slides. They're actually very nice slides. You can read them in the Power and Energy magazine. They basically show the value of storage tends to decline if you have more flexible generation. What about all the flexibility? As we've seen, and as we see in this graph, load requires a lot of flexibility already. We've designed the system to be able to manage the load. We did some work here at NREL a number of years ago taking a look at this question. Is there existing flexibility in the generation fleet that is not being used? And the answer is yes, there's quite a lot. I won't drag you through all the great details of this slide, but we found a tremendous amount of flexibility that exists, and in some cases there are no energy markets that allow you access to that flexibility, and that turns out to be a pretty important issue. So we think that you can get additional flexibility from your hardware, from new combustion turbines, reciprocating engines, hydro, for example, but we also need to ensure that we have institutional flexibility. If you have all this really nice generation that can respond quickly to commands to increase or decrease output, and yet you don't have any institutional framework that allows the system operator to say, I need more out of this plant, then we've got a problem. And so we've identified a number of institutional benefits so that we can take advantage of the flexibility that physically exists in the system. Demand response has promise. It's hard to know exactly how much demand response there might be. How often can you call upon it? What's its price? People have talked about plug hybrid vehicles in the future. We think that has a lot of potential. Don't know exactly how much potential. One of the other things that we've looked at in some detail is scheduling rules between balancing areas. And without dragging you through the details of this slide, if you look down towards the bottom, this is data from Bonneville that they have on their website. And we did some analysis, and the sort of the turquoise that you see represents the swings in capacity that Bonneville has to provide today as they deliver wind from their balancing area to outside their balancing area. If Bonneville were to change scheduling practice so that they don't just change once an hour, but they change every 5 minutes, the little red line that you can barely discern here represents the swings in the hydro that Bonneville would need to do much, much, much less than what's currently required with the hourly scheduling. Is wind as good as coal or nuclear? This report by Lawrence Berkeley, and there is an updated version of this. I was not able to get the slides for it in time for this webinar, but this shows that the power purchase price for wind is competitive with other power plants, depending upon the region you're looking at, depending upon the year the plant was built. And then if we go on and take a look at the capacity factors of wind compared to other generation sources, as a reminder on the right, we see that the load varies quite a lot from daytime to nighttime. And so we've built up our generation fleet so that we have nuclear units, coal units, for example, that have pretty high capacity factors. You look at other steam turbines and you say, well, they're starting to decline about 55%. You get to wind, and this is from the Midwest a couple of years ago. Capacity factor of wind is 30%, which is actually a little bit higher even than the hydro capacity factor. We also have plants that we've basically built to provide peak energy. And so you can see some of the combined cycle, the gas steam turbines, and so forth. You can pick your favorite here, out here to the right, that have capacity factors in the 10% or even less range. Does that mean that they're less important or that we don't need them? Not really. We need all these plants because they work in concert together to provide the variability that we need to be able to provide for in the electric load. What about limits? There's some maximum amount of wind that we can accommodate. In the work that's been done so far, we can manage up to 30% energy penetration. That's easier in the east than it is in the west because the eastern part of the U.S. generally has more flexibility in terms of markets, generally has larger operating footprints, and both of those things make it much easier to integrate wind. In the west, there are more challenges. I know that the focus of this webinar is not in the west, but if you have a lot of small balancing areas, as we have in the west, it's going to be a much more difficult task. There may be some changes needed in operational procedures and planning methods. Larger electrical footprints help. Sub-hourly dispatching within balancing areas helps a lot. Scheduling between balancing areas sub-hourly helps a lot. And notice a lot of these are really institutional issues as opposed to technical issues. And there's some other ways that we can get flexibility either institutionally or in other ways. I'm going to kind of wrap up here real quickly. We saw this graph earlier. With wind, you've got steeper ramps that you've got to manage. You've got lower turndowns. You've got to be able to manage those with more flexible units. We've seen some high penetration rates. We can manage them. And so let me see if I can just kind of summarize. Wind does bring in additional variability and uncertainty. We do know a lot about how we can manage this, and there's a lot of work going on to try to figure this out a little bit better. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Bob.
Michael, thank you very much. A lot of good information there. We're going to now go from the general to the specific. Bill Henson will talk about the perspective for New England in particular. Just a note on perspective here. Even wind's staunchest advocates, it's not uncommon to hear the question, why bear the impact associated with wind for a benefit that's not meaningful? And people might cite statistics like wind is only 1% of the mix and will always be a trivial contributor. But even wind's staunchest advocates are not claiming that wind will provide 100%, but rather that wind can someday be a material, can contribute a material proportion to the portfolio, 10 to 25%, somewhere on the order of other major wind energy sources. In advance of this webinar, I took a look at the mix of resources over the last 12 months of data available for New England. And in New England, we had 37% of the mix supplied by natural gas, 30% from nuclear, 12.5% from coal, 8% from hydro, about 5% from oil, and wind today ranks about the 10th contributor. But the analyses indicate that wind, within the range of scenarios that New England ISO is studying, that Bill will be telling us about, could very easily move to 7th on that list by the end of this year, 5th by about the middle of the decade, and 4th by about 2020, contributing roughly 10% of the system mix, and could easily move to 3rd behind only natural gas and hydro, and ahead of coal, oil, and large hydro within a reasonable period of time. So the point I wanted to make there is wind is only a trivial component of the mix if the well-sited wind already under development doesn't proceed, or if we can't figure out how to site wind well. As Mike Milligan has described, system operator studies are showing that wind can get to much higher shares of the mix without ruining reliability that is technically feasible, and the cost is modest in terms of increases in regulation, spinning reserves, and other inefficiencies that should, of course, be taken into the equation. But as Michael has pointed out, power systems differ. In Australia, where the power system is largely based on coal plants, or on islands like Ireland, the cost and challenges associated with adding wind can be much higher than in other areas. Here in New England, we're lucky to have one of the more flexible power systems in the world. We have a much higher share than typical of hydroelectric, of storage, of flexible natural gas power plants, and some of the most advanced of flexible energy markets. So Bill Henson of ISO New England will be telling us what the New England system operator has learned about the actual and expected impacts of increasing the contribution of wind to the system. Grid operators are the definitive source of understanding this information because it's their mandate. Their mandate is technical neutrality. The responsibilities include keeping the lights on, defining how much of the various types of reserves are necessary, and making sure all the costs are paid for. And they ultimately have to answer to all the owners and operators of all types of generation, including those that might end up running differently if wind's role increases. Bill has worked in wind power for approximately 9 years. He is currently working on his doctoral dissertation at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in wind power integration, reviewing electrical power and controls related articles for the journal Wind Engineering, and participating in a number of related task forces. He joined ISO New England to help write the request for proposals for the New England Wind Integration Study and to carry out the study and to implement its recommendations, as well as to evaluate renewable energy power generation and enable technologies and facilitate the cost-effective integration of renewable energy into the New England power system. Bill, we're thrilled to have you on board here and look forward to hearing what you've learned about wind integration in New England.
Great. Thanks, Bob. I suppose you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Actually, that's a great setup for what Bob was just talking about as to why we were really interested in doing this study. And I'll explain it to you a little bit more as we go through. But about a year and a half ago, ISO New England began this study to highlight the operational effects of large-scale wind integration into New England. We were helped in this effort by a team led by General Electric, GE, Energy Applications and Systems Engineering. They're the same folks that have been doing wind integration studies of the type that Ed and Michael have talked about for quite some time. We're really thrilled to have them on this effort. As Bob sort of alluded to, we expect the power system to go through changes, large changes potentially, in the coming years for a number of reasons. One of the things that we really like to do is we like to try and plan for those, because that helps us deal with the sort of the uncertainties that surround things. As Bob sort of also mentioned, wind could really be positioned for large-scale growth in New England, and that's because of the fairly high capacity factors of the wind resource here in New England, and also that the wind is not physically located on the other side of the world from where our load centers are. With transmission, it's actually quite close. We have, as Bob mentioned, we have a transparent set of markets, which means that people understand what the rules are, and the rules are published. And we offer a full suite of the power market products, and that really, as Michael I think was mentioning, the institutional flexibility that we have is a good thing. Really, it's a good thing for all. In the region, in the 6-state region in New England, there's some aggressive renewable energy and emissions policies, and also too, we do have a fleet that has a potential of having a very high flexibility that may aid in managing the variability. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of ISO New England and who we are and the system that we have, what our responsibilities are, and that sort of thing, just so you understand where it is that we're coming from. We're a not-for-profit corporation, started in 1997, but it has actually strong roots in the New England Power Exchange. It's been around for quite some time. We're regulated by the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, And we're independent. That's what the ISI and the ISO is, independent system operator. So we don't own any of the generation or any of the transmission. We don't have any financial interest in that. Our major responsibility number one is the reliable system operation. But then we have some additional responsibilities in order to sort of facilitate that. We administer competitive wholesale electricity markets, and we plan for the future. So, as I mentioned, New England is a 6-state region. We've got 6.5 million customers or so, 300 plus generators, 8,000 miles of high voltage transmission, interconnections to our neighbors. Our summer peak load of our all-time peak was 28,000 megawatts. And we've got about 32,000 megawatts of installed capacity that's generation that's available. I have to remember to hit the write down button. So there are three primary market mechanisms in New England. There are the energy markets, reserve markets, and forward capacity market. The energy market has a day ahead and a real-time component. And these markets reflect locational differences in the pricing. One of the important things about that is that it helps to highlight where load will best be served. And all of our resources participate within the market framework. The way we work the market is there's a unit commitment process that happens, and then when we're in the real time, the now, we do an economic dispatch where what we do is we select the minimum cost unit to run, or resources, I guess I should say, because our resources cover generation and demand and imports. And then we do that with a uniform clearing price auction that I'll show you in the next slide here. And the reason for that is to stimulate innovation. So whatever the marginal unit is that clears, so that the unit that clears with the price, its offer price, sets the uniform clearing price for the other resources. As I say, the reason for that is if you can come up with a resource that you're able to offer in with a lower price, you're able to make money, and that stimulates innovation to try and bring the offer cost down, to try and reduce your operating costs. I just wanted to show this slide. As Bob mentioned, we have quite a lot of natural gas generation in New England, and so the wholesale price of electricity here in New England tracks the price of natural gas quite well, and it has for quite some time. This is also what Bob was sort of speaking about. There's quite a bit of wind resources that are in our interconnection queue. Right now, we don't really have that much, I would say, in the way of wind generation that's currently operating in ISO New England. Maybe, say, 250 or so megawatts or so. But that number could grow substantially over the next few years. And so what we wanted to do was this is one of the drivers for why we did the New England Wind Integration Study, to try and make sure that there wouldn't be any insurmountable operational difficulties associated with integrating large-scale wind into New England. In 2009, the New England governors asked ISO New England for some technical assistance in developing their long-term renewable energy vision. And as a part of that, several scenarios were studied, and some transmission sort of was crayoned in, basically based on maps of where the wind potential is in New England. We had transmission planners who have a great deal of experience in developing transmission systems. Just see, based on these wind maps, where the likely regions of interest might be, and then using their experience, they developed what they thought would be a robust system in order to deliver that wind energy to our load centers. Actually, we reused those transmission scenarios, I guess you could call them, in the newest study in order to go and get the wind where it was. So this is the map on the right is a map out of the what I'll call the governor's study. It's the study that I just showed you on the previous slide. The green areas are the regions where there's a sort of a high wind potential, and the red and yellow areas are the areas where our load is. So you can see that there's a need for transmission, a significant amount of transmission in order to sort of go and get the wind where it is to ship it to the load centers in New England. So we needed a New England focused analysis, and the reason for that is that the impacts of wind on the system vary with the resources that are on the system, and they vary with what the characteristics of the wind are in the region. And so we started this New England Wind Integration Study, and it's a comprehensive study. As I said, it's meant to highlight the operational effects. We wanted to make sure, as I said, that there were no insurmountable operational difficulties that we'd see. We're not quite done with it yet, so today I'm going to share some details of the study that we've put together, and also some near final results. As I think Michael mentioned, the wind data that we used in this study was developed through a large-scale numerical weather prediction type model, very similar actually to the data that was developed for the Eastern Wind Integration and Transmission Study. Very similar. We did some additional validation, maybe some additional siting criteria, and we also developed a wind data set for the entire New England wind resource area, which sort of would encompass from New England up even into New Brunswick and the Maritimes, and certainly down the coast. So along the way, we wanted to, one of the tasks was to develop some recommendations for technical interconnection requirements, because wind is new to us, and we wanted to make sure that wind would be able to participate as a sort of a full member of the team to the extent that it was able to in things like supporting the grid and that sort of thing. So we actually released this report in November of 2009. You can see the link there on the screen. One other thing I'd like to mention about the NEWIS is that it's meant to be, as I said, a New England-focused study. So we were really concerned with making the results scientifically accurate, but also meaningful to New England stakeholders. And that's why we had several levels of review. We included the New England stakeholders in the process, and we've also had a technical review committee, an independent technical review committee, to help us ensure that the scientific accuracy and also the relevancy of this work. So we studied various scenarios, and the reason we did that was we wanted to see if we could develop some trending information to see sort of what the effects were in between particular scenarios. And also, we wanted to explore, say as a first step, what the near term would look like for us, and then also explore what larger penetrations of wind might look like for us as well. So from our interconnection queue, we had two scenarios that we looked at. A partial, I guess you could call it a build-out, a partial build-out of the wind generation that's in the interconnection queue of, you can see there 1.1 gigawatts of the nameplate capacity. And these are wind resources that have been through a lot of our interconnection process. We have a pretty high degree of confidence that they'll be showing up in the fairly near future. And then there's the full queue, which is all of the resources that at the time of the study were in the interconnection queue. And this number is still pretty close. So 4.1 gigawatts of nameplate. And both of these include onshore, primarily onshore wind resources. You'll see in a few slides what the different scenarios look like. I have some maps that I'll be showing to you. And then in addition to the full build out of the queue, we wanted to look at higher penetrations of potential wind energy. And so we looked at a medium and a high penetration scenario, but we looked at different alternatives for this medium and high penetration. For instance, perhaps the majority of the additional wind added on top of the full queue could be offshore, perhaps it could be onshore, perhaps it could be in different arrangements onshore. And as I say, you'll see that in a slide or two. And one thing too is that this is a system level study. We're not looking into local issues. We're very interested in how what the system-wide impacts would be for ISO New England. The next few slides, I'll have a table that you'll be able to see capacity factor. Capacity factor, I think Michael mentioned this, sort of mentions the productivity of a facility over time, sort of the actual production versus what the nameplate of the facility is. With NEWIS, we compared not the actual production because we don't have much actual production, but what the forecasted production would be using the computational fluid dynamics models. So here's the first of the wind scenarios that we took a look at, the partial build out of wind in the queue. These, as I mentioned, are the resources that are in our queue that we're fairly confident will be showing up in the near future. And in the table, you can see by state what the number of sites are in the state, what the nameplate is of the total per state. And further over towards the right-hand side of the table, you can see capacity factors of both by state, or even there's a total aggregate number. You can see 37 is the total aggregate capacity factor. So you can see there's a site that's it's an offshore site that's off the coast of. Oh yeah, that's right. I need to hold it down. You can see that there's an offshore site that's off the coast of Massachusetts. There are some sites that are up in northern New Hampshire and Maine, also in the eastern portions of Maine. The legend over here on the right side, if I can get my mouse to cooperate, you'll see these colors repeated in the next few slides. We wanted to just show that these additional sites are added sort of on top of the sites that are already in the queue. So the transmission system that we used for this particular wind scenario is the existing, what would be the existing system in 2019 or thereabouts. You can see that we've added some transmission in this next slide, and this is, as I say, this is a transmission configuration that we adapted from the governor's study that I mentioned earlier. You can see that there's some blue lines, some new blue lines, and there's a new pink line there. Those are the blue lines, I believe, are 115 kilovolt transmission, might be 345. But on the surface of it, it doesn't look like there's a lot of transmission there. But actually, this is a substantial build out of transmission. The main purpose of it is to go and get this wind that's sited up here in northern Maine. Again, the table with the capacity factors, and there's a fleet overall capacity factor there of 34%. The blue sites, as I mentioned earlier, are those in the partial queue. The green sites here and here up in northern Maine are the ones that are in the additional in the full queue. So these will be some of the higher penetration scenarios that we looked at. This one we call the best onshore. So in addition to the partial queue, the blue, and the full queue, the green, there are red sites that are the additional sites that we looked at. And this is one of the alternatives that we looked at, where we looked at what if all the additional capacity was onshore, and it was onshore ranked by capacity factor. So the red circles that you see are ranked by capacity factor, in that once we reached enough sites to make 20% of New England's annual energy, we stopped looking for wind sites. You can see the fleet capacity factor. Again, the average capacity factor for the years studied was 34%. And again, we have a pretty significant amount of transmission. This is from the governor's study, this is the 4 gigawatt transmission overlay that we used. So the next of the additional scenarios that we looked at was the what if all of it, instead of being scattered out through the best onshore locations, what if it was all located where the best offshore wind resources were, again by capacity factor? And that turns out to be all southeast of Nantucket, I suppose, and near Massachusetts there. The capacity factors you can see here are quite high. The overall fleet, it's 40%. This is the highest capacity factor scenario that we looked at. So here's another one of the scenarios that we looked at, the siting scenarios, I guess I should say, that we looked at. What if the offshore was spread out between the 3 states of Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, the additional sites to bring us to 20% energy, and then adding also to the best capacity factor sites from onshore. That's the last of the siting scenarios that I'll show you in the main presentation, but we looked at a few other ones as well that you can look in the bonus slides that I have included. So capacity value. Michael, I think, talked some about capacity value, and the next chart is going to show you the capacity values using the loss of load probability analysis technique that we used. And as I think Michael mentioned, it's an industry standard way of quantifying the reliability contribution of a generation resource to meeting the needs of the system. Also, too, and this is something that's been found in other studies besides the newest, the offshore wind has a tendency to correlate better with the load pattern, so that the capacity value of the scenarios that have a good deal of offshore wind, you'll see, is a little bit higher. And so that the chart indicates what the amount of offshore is. Say, for instance, in the best onshore case here, you can see that only 8% of the nameplate capacity of the fleet was offshore. And as expected, as the offshore amount rises, the capacity contribution, the capacity value also rises as well. The light blue bars here, the aqua bars, I guess, are the average over the 3 years that we looked at. So you can see that the capacity value using the ELCC, or the loss of load probability technique, ranges somewhere between 20% and, oh well, we have a good year here of say 42% or something like that. So that's a significant bonus to have an energy resource provide capacity as well. The next 4 slides that I'm going to show you are a little bit of eye charts, and I apologize for that. These are charts that I went through as I was trying to make sure that the simulations that we were doing were as accurate as possible, but I thought that they might be illustrative. So the output of each generation resource is stacked on top of each other, and the interesting thing about these plots is it's best to have the least variable resources on the bottom, because the width of the slice on the graph shows the amount of energy that's being produced. You'll see that the nuclear units' outputs are quite flat, and the combined cycle units change their output quite a bit. So this is a peak load. This is the peak load over the time frame that we looked at. And this is the results with no wind. So here again, the nuclear units are down here at the bottom. The less variable units are riding on top of them to meet the system load. The system load here is the pink line at the very top. If you add wind, significant amounts of wind, you reduce the amount that the peaking capacity is being run here. So the steam oil and steam gas units are operated less during this peak time. The same thing happens with the significant amount of offshore wind, although it matches the load peak a little bit better here. So again, it reduces the peaking conventional capacity to some degree. And here's even a worse eye chart. This is an interesting week, and I wanted to include this because not only did we see sort of what I would call great effects from wind, but we also saw effects that would cause us some more difficulties in that, in this instance, the wind happens to increase the amount of ramp that we would have to deal with, that our system would have to be capable of dealing with, the amount of load following ramp. So in the morning, in the middle of the night, when the load is very low, the wind is quite high. That's this yellow here. The load is quite low. As the load grows to a high amount, the wind drops off in this particular instance. And then as the load falls off, again, the wind comes back up again. So this would have been a very interesting week. This is an overall result of one of the years that we studied. You can see that the annual energy by fuel type, wind displaces mostly combined cycle natural gas, but also too, it's very difficult to see, but the steam oil and steam gas also are reduced to some degree. And this chart shows by penetration scenario as well. So as Michael, I think, talked about, the emissions do go down. We used a pretty high fidelity model when we were modeling here, where we modeled heat rates that would change with the generator's output level, and so as we add wind, the emissions do decrease for the entire system. For CO2, you can see in the chart here, and also in the chart over here on the right, that it's not quite one for one. As you get more wind, you have a little bit more of a benefit for CO2 reduction, and that's because as you get higher penetrations of wind, you have a tendency to displace not just natural gas, but also coal, which produces more CO2. So, just a few more slides to go. One of the things that I think both Michael and Ed talked about was regulation. Regulation is the sort of the fine-tuned control that we use to make sure that the power system balance is maintained. And one of the things that we observed was that changes will be required to our regulation capacity requirements, and that the increase is mostly due to short-term wind power forecast error, not necessarily the fluctuations themselves. It's more due to the uncertainty. And these again are, as I've said before, are preliminary results. But as you can see, there's what looks to be a sort of a linear relation between the amount of wind, so the wind penetration is down here on the bottom, and the regulation requirement here on the left. We took two different estimates of it because we wanted to sort of have a high and a low. The reserves are sort of, as Michael also mentioned, are sort of our insurance policy, and it's meant to protect against credible contingencies, things like generators that might go offline or transmission lines that might have a fault. And we use several types of reserves here in New England, and because of winds, our imperfect ability to forecast wind, we will also need increased reserves. This slide here shows in a similar fashion the preliminary results that we have with increases in reserve requirements. So if you trace over here, say for no wind on the system, our 10-minute spinning reserve requirement is, our average 10-minute spinning reserve requirement is about 700 or so megawatts in any given hour. And as you increase wind, the penetration of wind, even in the 20% scenarios, let's say the increase goes up to somewhere around, say, 1,100 or so megawatts of required reserves. So these are this is my final slide with sort of the overall observations that we have so far. As I said, we're not quite done yet. We will be presenting more expansive results to our New England stakeholders at the forum is the Planning Advisory Committee. The capacity factors, as I've shown, are quite good, but they do diminish with increasing penetration. Sorry, the capacity values do diminish with the increasing penetration, and also if the transmission is not available. Wind could displace combined cycle oil and gas-fired steam units under the high penetration scenarios in the energy market. But one of the things that we've learned in this study is although our system has potential for high flexibility, we need to maintain that fleet flexibility, and doing so under decreased energy market revenues is a potential challenge for us. Some coal is displaced at higher levels too if no carbon tax is assumed. We have found that centralized wind power forecasting, the quality of the wind power forecasting will have a significant impact on our ability to integrate wind. And as the wind penetration levels increase in New England, we will require more regulation and reserves capability in order to maintain our reliability. As I showed you in those map slides, essentially above levels of what is in the queue, what will we have a high degree of confidence in showing up in the queue? If we get beyond those levels, significant transmission expansion and upgrades will be required in order to effectively integrate those scenarios. I think that's about all I have in my main presentation for. So I think with that, I'll probably turn it back over to Bob. I know I probably hustled through some of those, but I'm trying to help keep us on track on the time so we can have plenty of time for our Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. Very helpful. So let's see. If we can go to the slide here for the mechanics of the call. Again, I'll keep this up on the screen as a reminder for how to do this. I see we've got about 15 questions already posed. I will go through them in order. So please use the Q&A feature to raise your question, and I will go through them one at a time here. Just a note, it is about 10 minutes of 3, no more like 5 minutes of 3. Michael Milligan will have to leave not too long from now. DeMeo and Bill Henson can stick around longer, so we'll be able to keep working through some questions for a little while. I will start with the first question here. And having a little bit of trouble with the Q&A board. Okay, so we have a question here from Gregory Fennell, who has asked, what do you see as the future of energy storage? Do you believe it will be required, and to what extent? A recent preliminary National Renewable Energy Report on Eastern Wind Integration Study does not believe it is technically required, but another report from Sandia in 2010 gives many non-internalized benefits of storage that may not be captured by arbitrage alone. Thank you.
This is Michael. I can take a shot at that. We have not done an exhaustive study to look at storage. What we have done is looked at both the Eastern study, which the system works without storage, and the Western study. We looked at storage only from an arbitrage point of view, and we recognize there are other ways that storage could be utilized. Flywheels for regulation, for example. And it is, it's a good question. I mean, there's a market value and there's sort of a value of storage that can be monetized. There are probably some values that cannot be. So I think there's more work that could be done to look at that in detail. At this point, we don't think it's required, but storage does have value, and some of those values are going to be relatively easy to measure, and others may not be easy to measure. But I think the other sort of the point that I'd like to make is that we think that depending upon what it is you're looking for, if it's some sort of flexibility on the load following time frame, there are probably multiple ways of getting that flexibility, and storage ought to be considered alongside everything else. We think that it makes sense to go after the ones that are most cost effective, and certainly storage prices may well come down and make it more effective. These studies are looking out 10 and 20 years from now, so it's pretty hard to predict what storage prices are going to look like at that point.
This is Bill. When we looked at storage, we also looked at it from an arbitrage standpoint, mostly, and we saw that there were some increases in use with wind penetration, but there was no need for new large-scale storage. I would agree with Michael about the flexibility, the system flexibility point, in that anything that reduces our system flexibility will make it more challenging for us to integrate wind. And so having the flexible resources that we have on the New England system certainly makes the system run better in all cases.
Okay, I'm going to go on to the next question then. This one was posed by Kevin McCarthy, who asks, so then spinning reserve is the same as contingency reserve? I think that's a clarification question.
Well, this is Michael. I probably introduced that, and I'll let Bill jump in and correct me. The rules differ a little bit in terms of different reliability organizations, such as the Western versus Eastern, but they're not the same. In the West, the contingency reserve requirement is that you need to have, it's about 6% of your peak load. There's an older rule, 5% of the load supplied by hydro and 7% by thermal. But the basic requirement is that half of that contingency reserve needs to be spinning, and the other half needs to be available within 10 minutes. And so that 10-minute reserve you could get off of non-spinning units. You can quickly start them and synchronize them. But you might have actually more than that 3% that's spinning just because you may not have non-spin available, or it may be that you're setting up your generation to do something different. You've got plenty of spin available.
All right. Thank you, Michael. The next question is posed by David Hyman from the Green Group in Boston, Massachusetts. The question is knowing the mean and standard deviation of the wind speed sufficient to address the uncertainty, or does one need more sophisticated analysis? If more sophisticated methods are needed, what are they?
Well, this is Michael. I'll take a shot at that because I feel guilty because I got to take off from the airport here in a minute. So, but the essential, the standard deviation and the mean give you a sense of the variability of the wind. It doesn't necessarily tell you about the uncertainty. But the integration studies typically have another piece that I didn't really have a chance to talk about, which is not only do you have simulated actual wind, but we also try to get a simulation of what a wind forecast would look like. And that's sort of based on the, what do we know about forecasting errors today for wind. And so you set up the simulated system by saying, let's only give it the knowledge of the wind forecast. And so you go through the usual unit commitment process, and then you get into the actual day or hour, and we're actually simulating the fact that you've got a forecast error. The forecast error rates depend upon how far in advance the forecast occurs. Hour ahead is somewhere in the 5 to 7% mean absolute error. Day ahead somewhere around 15%. It depends on penetration and regime and so forth. So the uncertainty and the variability aren't quite the same, although some folks would argue that the standard deviation is a rough approximation of the uncertainty, but we don't typically do that in the integration studies.
This is Bill. You have to be a little careful when you're talking about standard deviation and mean, in that if load and wind were perfectly uncorrelated, then you'd have a little better of a shot at it with mean and standard deviation. But that's the whole reason for the net load issue is that they're neither perfectly uncorrelated, nor perfectly correlated, nor perfectly anti-correlated. So it's really, you need both pieces of information, and that's where the simulation of the system really advances your knowledge of the impacts.
So this is Bob. I'll just look to clarify one thing. I think the questioner is perhaps interpreting the description of the studies that were done as using mean and standard deviation of wind speed. It is my understanding that the analyses use actual very detailed sub-hourly wind profiles, and that the mean and standard deviation is a way of summarizing that information, but that's not the actual wind data that's used. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, for me, Bob.
Likewise for me, too.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. The next questioner is Matt Rarity, a senior wind integration analyst for Puget Sound Energy in Washington. His question is for Mr. Milligan, if you are still there, Mike.
I'm here.
When assessing the capacity value of wind, how do you make the connection between effective load carrying capacity, using loss of load probability analysis for long-term planning purposes, and the reality of meeting peak demand or the potential loss of load hour in real time? It's one thing to calculate a 5, 10, or 15% capacity value of wind and use that number for resource planning, but it's another to use that value when trying to meet peak demand in real time or even day ahead or month ahead. Thank you.
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and I agree that we use ELCC and various loss of load probability-based metrics to figure out how much generation do we have to build, and that's a different question than how am I going to operate the system. And let me sort of make the analogy with a conventional plant. So forgetting about wind, you can go off and do an ELCC study and an LOLP study and figure out how much generation do I want to build, and you come up with some answer and you build some gas and coal and hydro and whatever. And what that tells you is that now I've got a system of generation, or a portfolio of generation, that is sufficient to meet my needs to get me to 1 day in 10 years or whatever your reliability target is. Now, for any individual day or hour or week or month, your conventional unit maybe it's down for maintenance for 3 months, or maybe it had a forced outage that takes it out of service for 6 or 8 weeks. And so the way that you schedule the system is going to depend on the load. It depends on what units are not on maintenance, whether they're forced or planned maintenance. And the other issue with LOLP is that we're really looking at these critical times, generally peak times. And so most utilities have weeks and even months where you're not putting any stress on capacity at all. your loads are low, you've got a lot more installed capacity than you need, and that isn't, you don't build capacity for the month of April, for example, in most areas because you've got more capacity than you need in April, and that's particularly true in the Northwest when you get lots of hydro flows. So we don't really care if wind contributes in those times where it's not needed, when you don't need capacity. What we do care about is that it contributes alongside the other units during times where the need is greater. And any given unit can have an outage, and so the loss of load probability technique takes that into account when you're trying to figure out how much generation to build. But you're right, scheduling is a different issue, but I don't necessarily need to schedule all of my capacity all the time anyway, and so this recognizes that fact. And Bill may want to add something to that.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is that the way that LOLP calculation is used in the wind integration studies, at least that I'm familiar with, and certainly in the newest, is that we use the wind profiles. We don't come up with some probability distribution for what the wind might be doing and then apply that to the loss of load probability calculation. We use the actual synthesized wind data along with the actual historical load data. So it's not as if we've separated out the variability of the wind all on its own in a sort of a random statistical process sense. We've included the variability along with the load variability that the dispatchable resources are going to need to be able to meet. As I mentioned before, wind and load are neither perfectly correlated, nor perfectly uncorrelated, nor perfectly anti-correlated, at least in this part of the world. And so you need to use this net load concept when you use the LOLP as opposed to using some sort of Weibull distribution or whatever for the wind power production forecast.
Just to add one thing, this is Ed, and guys, you can correct me if I don't have this right, but in doing the hour-to-hour simulation of the operation of the system, you just don't use the capacity credit number at all. It's a totally different kind of analysis.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes, Ed.
Okay, thank you. Just a note here, I see a number of folks that have raised hands on the Q&A board, but who I don't see questions there. Dwayne Brieger, Alex Reck, Paul McGlynn, Chris Kapsemblis. You'll need to finish typing your question and submit it for me to see it. So I know we're going to be losing Michael Milligan shortly. Let me go on to the next question here. This one is posed by Tom in Ohio. Does any of the analysis consider economic dispatch factors, locational marginal pricing, or is it built on assumptions about the future build-out? Does the analysis reflect the thermal impacts of today's wind energy penetration in the ISO region, or does it make adjustments for higher penetration levels planned in the future? I'm going to break there. Tom has asked a whole series of questions here, and let me let them be answered first.
Well, this is Michael. I'll take one shot, and then I do need to duck out, but I'll let Bill pick up the pieces here. The locational marginal price is a byproduct of the modeling, and so you can put in a wind scenario. For example, we did this with the Eastern study, and you can see what impact does wind have on LMPs. It's not, the LMPs are not an input to the study per se, but we can run the model, with wind, without wind, with different scenarios of wind to get an idea of how it works. The simulations do have characteristics of all the plants, so the simulation is, it's kind of a ground-up sort of a thing where you can change assumptions about the types of plants that you have and how much wind you have and so forth, but the models. We don't do this in the West because the West doesn't run on LMPs, but in the East, you can certainly look at that. I'll let Bill follow up if he's got anything to add.
Yeah, certainly in the newest we used LMPs as part of the simulation, the production simulation of the system.
Okay. I'm going to ask another one or two of Tom's questions, and then maybe come back to the rest of them later on, just to give other people a chance to ask. The next of his questions was, how much hydrocarbon-based fuel is required to transform a given wind energy resource in New England ISO into a capacity resource, and does this change with growing penetration of wind? I think that would be for you, Bill?
Yeah, it sounds like it's for me. Actually, I think that this question is sort of not well posed, in that the way to do it is to aggregate the system. The aggregating effect that the transmission system has allows us to deal with the uncertainty and variability, not just of wind, but also of load too. And in sort of the idea of matching up one for one a conventional generator with each wind plant is not really the right way to formulate the question. Really, the right way to formulate the question is how does everything in the system interact with each other? It's just, I think Michael might have even mentioned, you could build I suppose a gas turbine at every wind plant in order to turn it into a quote unquote firm resource, but that would be a rather expensive proposition, and there's no need, certainly system wide, that we see for that.
Thank you, Bill. Let me go on to the next questioner. This is his name is Charles, and he asks, many New England towns and cities are struggling with consideration of installing 1 or 2 turbines at 1.5 to 3 megawatts. How can these small units be integrated into the system with huge connection and transmission costs, as well as the variability of imperfect management, as opposed to the professional management of a major wind farm? And corollary here is, what about the recent studies showing lower wind production over the past decade?
I'm trying to think. This is Bill. I'm trying to think. So this is sort of a local integration question, is what it sounds like to me. And the answer, at least from the newest, is as I said in the presentation, we didn't look at local issues at all. The transmission overlays, I guess, or build-out scenarios that we assumed in our study, it was assumed that the wind plants would be connecting to those transmission configurations in order to supply the system. We didn't look at local congestion issues or things like that at all. The focus of the study for us was to see what the operational effects of large-scale wind integration in New England would be. We were less concerned about what the local effects might be. The reason being is we need to maintain the system reliability, and local issues are not something that we really had in the scope of this study. Okay.
This is Bob Grace. Let me take a stab here. I believe that the question, I'm trying to do justice to the questioner, breaks down into 3 pieces. One, talking about the relatively larger scale connection and transmission costs associated with small projects. I think those are issues that go into the financial viability of those projects and aren't really an operations issue at all. The second question, I believe, is one of having to do with scale. So if you have a small wind farm, you might not have people that are operating and submitting forecasts that have high accuracy to the degree that a 100-megawatt wind farm would clearly justify a major wind developer having people involved in the operations at a much deeper level. So I think, Bill, the question there was, do we lose some of that accuracy in being able to manage and predict when you're dealing with smaller wind farms?
Sorry about that. One of the things that we have found out through this study, and is actually in the Task 2 report, as I mentioned in my presentation, was we looked at sort of distributed wind from what the forecasting requirements might be in order to come up with a good forecast for it. And it would definitely be important for us to be able to come up with an accurate forecast, but it's very likely that we will be able to have an accurate forecast if we know information like the exact location and model specs of the distributed wind. Essentially, then what happens is it modifies our load forecast. But we'll still be going forward, I think, with a centralized wind power forecast. The thing is that the distributed wind projects that aren't necessarily transmission system connected will be taken care of by the centralized wind power forecast by knowing things like the location and the size of the units.
Right. And I think the last part of the question might be one that I'll ask Ed DeMeo to respond to. That was, what about the recent studies showing lower wind production over the past decade?
Well, I have to beg ignorance on that because I don't know about that recent study.
Okay.
Same goes, Bob. I don't know about. I'm not sure what the question is actually asking.
Okay. Move on to the next one here. This is posed by Dorothy in Massachusetts, and the question is, are emissions from reserves accounted for in the calculation of carbon emission reduction achieved by wind penetration presented on the slide? So I assume that is for Bill.
Sure. So the short answer is yes. The emissions are counted because essentially what happens is you have to take them into account when you're doing your unit commitment and your dispatch in the simulation. And so those units are indeed running, and they're being committed and run in the simulation. So yes, the spinning reserves are being accounted for in the emissions.
I think this is much like Michael Milligan's example of the carpooling, where there are some units that are operating less efficiently.
Yes, I think that's probably a good description, Bob.
Putting out greater emissions on a per unit basis, but you're operating less, or you're burning less fuel overall. Is that correct, Bill? Bill?
Sorry, Bob. I was agreeing with you that sorry, I had it on mute. I was agreeing with you that it's probably very similar to the carpooling description.
Okay.
But Bob, if I could add one thing, this is Ed. What hasn't yet been studied in any great detail is what happens within the hour. You know, the simulations that Michael and Bob and Bill have been talking about have used hourly data. What we do know is that the operation of the plants within the hour, the ramping up and down on a minute-to-minute basis, does have some additional inefficiencies associated with that. So there is likely to be some increase in emissions over what we've already calculated from that factor. What we don't know is how big that is. We don't think it's large, but we have to say that it hasn't been studied in detail.
Okay, so that's an area for further study that suggests that that further study might suggest moderately higher emissions than the initial study's results presented here?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ed.
Yeah. Great. I'm going to take an opportunity here to pose a question of my own. I think the last couple of questions here has teed up an interesting issue that's worth talking about. In operating a power system, there's a difference between dispatch, you know, turning a power plant up or down, and commitment, turning it on or off. I've heard argued that if we can't forecast or control wind variability, that you can't change commitment and can't turn plants off, and therefore aren't displacing fossil fuels. So can you explain that set of issues and the apparent contradiction with the results of the studies that you've presented?
Bob, this is Bill.
Yeah.
I would say that what we observed in the newest anyway is that it had a significant impact on our unit commitment.
So does that mean that the forecasting is assumed or expected to be
forecasting
accurate enough in order to be able to impact unit commitment with reasonable accuracy?
Yes, forecasting is critical. Good forecasting is critical.
Yeah, just to add to this is Ed, what's been found from many of the studies is that the value of a forecast, even though it's imperfect, is quite substantial in deciding what the day-ahead commitment schedule should be. And in fact, if one had a perfect forecast, there would be additional value, but it turns out it isn't all that much. So you might get, say, 80% of the value of forecasting with the accuracy that's available today.
Great, thank you. The next question is posed by Rachel, who is in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Does the New England-based report deal with the geographic distribution of wind sites, in other words, the last alternative versus the clustered offshore, related to uncertainty?
Actually, that's something that we noticed in the study, is that the more distributed the wind was, the less variability, and therefore really the less uncertainty about that variability there was. We didn't actually notice huge changes, though, in the amounts of uncertainty and variability between the different sighting scenarios. But yes, that's actually one of the main reasons why we posed the different sighting scenarios, was to take a look and see how that diversity would impact us. I don't have final results, but as I say, we did notice some effect, but it wasn't as large actually as we thought it was going to be.
Thank you. The next question is posed by Emmy at the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and her question is there a way to increase the displacement of coal in New England without driving up the cost of electricity?
I don't know the answer to that one, Bob.
Okay. I mentioned earlier that I had taken a look at some recent statistics on the relative share of generation in the region, and noted that the coal contribution to the mix is already fairly small. It was not very long ago that coal was a material contributor of probably 20% or more of the mix, or at least somewhere in the high teens. And at least over the last year, coal has only been 12.5% of the New England mix. So a lot of the coal, I believe, has been getting displaced by natural gas over the last several years as the operating fleet has turned over and been modernized. So I think part of the reason, and Bill, please correct me if I'm wrong here, that we're not seeing as much displacement of coal as you might see in some of the Midwest or Western studies, is that there isn't as much coal to displace.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Without, I'm not the perfect forecaster here, but without some sort of additional cost for carbon or for coal, I don't really see us displacing too much coal, just because it's a pretty cheap resource, and we don't have that much of it on the system now. Not nearly as much as many of the Midwestern ISOs do.
Great, thank you. The next question is posed by Ed Linton in Barre, Vermont, and he asks, what will the loss of Vermont Yankee and increased imports from Hydro-Quebec do to the value of increasing wind capacity in New England?
We didn't study that, Bob. I don't have a good answer for you.
Okay. Apologies to Ed there. We will move on to the next question, which is posed by Gurpreet Niraj. I apologize if I have pronounced that accurately, who is an associate with the Resource Systems Group in Vermont. And his question is, what model was used to calculate avoided emissions in ISO New England with increasing wind penetration? The question is particularly directed to Bill Henson.
So I'm not exactly sure what the question means, but what we did was we used a production simulation type platform. We stepped through the system on an hourly basis for each of the 3 years that we studied, and because of that, we know from that model which units ran when and that sort of thing. So we know what their heat rates are, we know what their emissions rates are, and so that sort of information falls out of the analysis. I'm not quite, we didn't really use a model to calculate avoided emissions. We used the simulation in order to have those results fall out, essentially.
Ed, is that something that you could discuss on a more typical basis for some of the other studies?
Well, I think it's exactly what Bill says. You do the production simulation, and one of the outputs is the energy from the plants. Another output is how much SO2, how much CO2, et cetera. So those numbers do naturally fall out from the analysis.
So that these production models typically include functional relationships between the level of operation and the emission of a particular pollutant?
Yeah, if you want to get that information, you can get it out of the model, out of the calculations.
Thank you. The next question is posed by Ning Lu at PNNL in Richland, Washington. Very informative presentation. Have you studied the value of demand response programs for wind integration?
Well, I can give you the particular in the newest, but maybe Ed can talk about maybe the more general sense. We did include demand response in our portfolio when we did the study, and from again, it's a little bit like the storage, the large scale storage. Because of the flexibility of the system, we didn't really observe it being activated very much. But then again, as I said, anything that reduces the flexibility that we have on the system is going to make it more difficult for us to integrate variable resources like wind power.
Yeah, this is Ed. To add to that, demand response has been studied and included in some detail in some of the other major studies like the EWITS and in particular the Western Wind and Solar Integration Study that Michael mentioned. And yes, demand response is found to be really quite valuable. For example, in the Western study done by the General Electric people, the demand response actually made up a fairly significant portion, I forget the number, maybe 10 or 20% of the reserves that were used, and that was found to be far more cost effective than assigning or building additional plants to provide that additional level of reserves. So yeah, it's been studied at some detail in a number of the projects.
All right. Another question from Douglas Smith at Green Mountain Power. This is for Bill. Does the scope of the newest include estimation of wind integration costs in $1 per megawatt hour of wind, comparable to the figures from the other studies that Michael showed in his presentation? If so, what do your preliminary results suggest?
No, we did not study the integration costs. We were more concerned with the numbers, the values of things like capacity, the numbers, as opposed to what those numbers might cost.
Bill, is that envisioned as something that might be addressed in a subsequent phase of the study?
That could be. I don't know.
I can imagine that would be of a lot of interest to people.
Bill, I'm sorry, was GE the primary contractor?
That's right.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's sort of two approaches to these integration studies. There's one that the GE people have used, and there's another that some of the other engineering consultants have used. And the GE people have never really warmed to the idea of calculating an integration cost. Instead, they have tried to look at the entire picture. What are the impacts of the wind on the system? And they've come up, in many cases, with a value for the kilowatt hour of wind, which includes everything, including the impact of the integration cost. So it's unlikely that that number is going to come out of the GE approach. but some of the other people that have done these analyses have actually focused on that particular number. It's an interesting question. It's a sort of a debate that runs through the community that does these studies.
Well, and then too, Ed, there's market dynamics issues that I wouldn't know how to address.
Yeah.
It certainly seems to be the type of question that people want to know the answer to the extent that the valid question is raised. If there are these costs of integrating wind, do they offset the value of wind? And at least some of those Midwest studies have suggested that the cost might degrade the value a little bit, but it's often less than 10%. But these things are system specific. So
right, that's right.
And I will pose the question to Bill: is if there's a further phase of the analysis, that might be a good question to try to pose and answer in that phase. Another question was from Jim Rogers, who asked, many towns through Massachusetts are looking to erect 1 or 2 wind turbines with hefty subsidies accruing to the town. What, if anything, is one turbine actually doing to reduce CO2 emissions or cause a power plant to run any less?
Well, this is Ed. I'll take a crack at that. I mean, 1 or 2 turbines, yes, doesn't have much of an impact on the grand scheme of things. You'd have to look at this in aggregate. If there are many communities that are doing this, then, yeah, in aggregate they could have an effect. You know, it's kind of like voting, you know, like next Tuesday. What difference does my one vote make? Well, I can't look at it that way. I've got to look at you know, what difference does voting in general make? It's really very important in aggregate.
Yeah, this is Bill. In a total sense, I would agree with Ed, but in a sort of a how many, let's say, megawatts of conventional resources does a very small wind installation replace? In a one-by-one sort of thing, in very small amounts. I showed in the slides that the capacity value of wind can be quite high. So it can be as high as a sort of a one-to-one type thing in a very in the very small. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that's an important question to answer. These are the questions that are being asked where individual wind turbines are getting sited, and the people in those towns need to know that there's a benefit, or whether there's a benefit in exchange for impacts to viewsheds and so forth.
Right.
Sure. Bob, this is Bill. I'm going to beg for time off here. I've got to go take care of some stuff. So.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask the last question here.
Okay.
We can hold on for one more. I think we will work through everything. The last question was posed by Bill Vino of the Martha's Vineyard Commission in Massachusetts. The first presentation stated that large balancing areas are preferable over small balancing areas. Is there a figure for megawatts or percentage of the system or distribution of wind facilities to differentiate between large and small? The scenarios indicated different scales of wind turbine installations by size of dots. What was the megawatt of the smallest of these?
You know, Bob, I'll be honest, I don't know offhand what the smallest of those was. If it was in our interconnection queue as of the beginning of the project, it's in there, and there are some pretty small ones that are on the order of, say, well, I don't know, 5 to 10 megawatts, let's say. It's being we've modeled them, so that's the size of the smallest units. Great.
Ed, is there something you can add to that in terms of the scale of the balancing areas and that impact?
Yeah, I don't think so. It's just in general, at least as far as people have gone with it, bigger seems to be better. Mm-hmm. The more units you have to choose from, the more interconnections you have with neighbors, the more you can average out variations in load, the more you can average out variations in wind, the better it's going to be.
So, like many things, bigger or smaller don't have any absolute meaning, but they're relative. Anytime you can expand the system or add more diversity to it, that increases the ability for the system to adequately integrate wind?
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, you might get into practical limitations with just how big can you go with it. Do you want to go for the entire United States? Well, that's a whole nother ball of wax.
And does this work the other way on the other extreme? So if you have local transmission or distribution constraints, that might effectively make an area seem much smaller and increase the potential issues associated with integration?
Absolutely. We have some examples of that, particularly out here in the West. The utility that serves most of Montana, for example, has very weak connections with the rest of the West, and they're working hard on that, but right now that's the situation. And it's difficult for them to integrate wind because they just don't have many options to pick from to help out.
So, Bill, let me pose a last question to you. I think today much of Maine is seen as somewhat constrained. Is the newest study, in effect, modeling adding enough transmission to do away with those types of constraints so that Maine, for example, or parts of Maine wouldn't have those types of local issues?
First, as Ed was talking, it got me thinking a little bit. In sort of a relative terms sense, the ISO New England is actually a pretty large balancing area. And as I mentioned before, we have a lot of institutional flexibility in things like the fast markets that we have. And as you sort of mentioned, if you get really very small, I think yes, the issues may be larger. So transmission is really usually it's more the problem than balancing for an area like ISO New England. And yes, in the study, the scenarios, the transmission configurations that we adapted from the governor's study essentially showed very little congestion. They showed some, but very little congestion. So as I mentioned, we were more interested in the system-wide issues. And so I would say that the local issues, like I said, they weren't really in the scope of the study, so we don't know exactly what those effects might be. But there could be significant problems with local issues.
Great. Thank you. I'd like to thank our speakers very much for this very helpful, informative, and detailed presentation, as well as your participation in the dialogue. I believe we've gotten through all the questions now. Just as a wrap-up here, the next New Week webinar will focus on the impacts of wind turbine shadow flicker. It will be scheduled for sometime in January with information to be forthcoming. If you would like to opt into the distribution list for the New Week webinars, the link is shown on the screen here to do so, and that sign-up will allow you to receive both New Week webinar invitations as well as the New England Wind Forum newsletter, another DOE and NREL funded initiative. The materials from this webinar, number 4, will be posted on the New England Wind Forum website at the link shown by approximately November 9th. And those posted materials will include a number of things: the recorded webinar and transcript, an annotated bibliography and references on the topic. So I believe that might already be posted or will be very shortly. So we've provided a lot of information, peer-reviewed studies and others on wind integration issues and the other issues addressed today, including some studies that come to conclusions different from those presented by the speakers. If others out there are aware of other sources that are not included in our bibliography, we would ask that you forward that information to us at the same email that you used to register for the webinar, and we'd be happy to add those to the bibliography. And we'll also be posing all the questions asked by the participants. So again, thank you to the speakers, thank you to the participants very much, and we look forward to your participation in the next webinar. And enjoy your week.
Thanks, everyone.
That does conclude today's conference call. You may now disconnect and have a great rest of your day.